hadn't planned to spend my afternoon at an office, let alone in Evelyn's office. But a last-minute request from Tom brought me here. Tom's neighbor, Evelyn, was his go-to person for work advice, given her decades in the industry. She needed help updating some tech systems in her office, and I was roped in. It was supposed to be quick and straightforward, but that was before I met her. When I arrived, Evelyn was seated behind a sleek desk, her silver hair catching the light as she looked up, greeting me with a warm, inquisitive smile. Despite being in her 60s, she radiated a confidence that was both calming and slightly intimidating. Her posture was graceful, and there was a quiet strength about her, a dignity that made her seem untouchable. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice soft, warm, and somehow familiar. I hope Tom didn't make it sound too urgent. I could have managed. Her words were humble, but I could sense an unspoken relief. I shook my head, trying to appear nonchalant. "Not at all. I'm happy to help." I settled into a chair near her desk, glancing around her office. It was filled with books, artifacts from her travels, and framed photos that hinted at a life rich in experiences. As I walked her through a few of the updates, I found myself watching her closely, noting the way she tilted her head when she listened, her thoughtful expressions as she processed each step. She'd lean forward occasionally, her fingers tracing a line along the edge of her desk, her touch delicate, almost absent-minded. Our work was interspersed with light conversation. She told me a bit about her career and her love of travel, sharing glimpses of her life with a quiet openness that felt rare and refreshing. There was something about the way she spoke, the way her eyes would soften when she recounted certain memories that drew me in, made me want to know more. At one point, she paused, a pensive look crossing her face. "It's strange," she said slowly, her gaze drifting to the window. "I've spent years in this office, yet it still feels temporary somehow, like I'm just passing through." I glanced at her, intrigued. "Maybe that's what makes it interesting," I offered. "The feeling that something new is always around the corner." She looked at me then, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Perhaps you're right," she murmured, a faint smile touching her lips. Her gaze lingered, and for a moment, the air between us felt different, heavier, as if we'd crossed into a territory neither of us had anticipated. We returned to work, but the atmosphere had shifted, the air charged with something unspoken. I became more aware of her presence beside me, the warmth of her hand as it brushed against mine when we reached for the same folder. Our hands met briefly, a fleeting touch, but I felt it, an unmistakable spark that sent a shiver up my spine. She didn't pull away immediately, and neither did I. Instead, we remained like that for a second longer than necessary, her fingers resting against mine, warm and soft. I glanced up, meeting her gaze, and saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe even longing. She drew her hand back, a faint blush coloring her cheeks as she looked away, pretending to refocus on the task at hand. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, a hint of nervous laughter in her voice. "It's been a while since I've had someone here actually working with me. I must seem a bit out of practice." "No apology needed," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. "I think it's nice working with someone who's genuine." She looked at me then, her expression unreadable, but there was a warmth in her gaze that made my heart beat a little faster. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. The subtle intimacy of the moment lingered, hanging in the air even as we continued our work. We were sitting closer now, our voices soft, as if we were sharing secrets rather than discussing tech updates. I could feel a tension building between us, an awareness that went beyond mere familiarity. Each time our eyes met, there was a silent acknowledgement, a recognition of something neither of us dared put into words. As the afternoon wore on, she reached over my shoulder to adjust a document on her screen. Her hand brushed against my arm, light as a feather, yet it sent a thrill through me, unexpected and intense. She paused, her hand hovering, as though she'd felt it too. I glanced up, catching her gaze, and for a moment, neither of us moved. "Thank you again for helping me with this," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes held mine, and I felt a warmth there, something deeper than just gratitude. "It's my pleasure," I replied, my voice soft, almost reverent. "I'm glad Tom introduced us." She tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Tom is lucky to have friends like you." The quiet compliment made my pulse quicken. I found myself leaning closer, drawn in by her calm presence, her scent, a delicate mix of something floral with a hint of warmth that was entirely hers. Her eyes lingered on my face, studying me with a focus that felt both comforting and unnervingly intimate. I could sense her hesitation, a slight uncertainty that mirrored my own, as if we were both standing on the edge of something floral with a hint of undeniable intimacy. There was a silence that seemed to stretch, amplifying every small sound, the soft hum of her computer, the faint rustle of papers on her desk. I could feel the tension building, a current that seemed to pull us closer, yet kept us at arm's length. She finally broke the silence, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Life has a way of surprising you, doesn't it?" she said, a faraway look in her eyes. "You think you've settled, that things are the way they'll always be, and then, suddenly, something shifts." I nodded, her words resonating in a way that went beyond our current setting. "Sometimes it's those unexpected moments that mean the most," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "They remind you there's more, that there's still room for something new." She smiled, her expression softening, and I could feel the weight of everything left unsaid hanging between us. There was an intensity in her gaze, a flicker of vulnerability that made her seem younger, more open. For the first time, I saw past the polished, poised exterior she wore so effortlessly. I saw her, just her, without the layers of experience, without the years that separated us. A faint blush colored her cheeks, and she looked down, a gentle laugh escaping her lips. "I must be rambling," she murmured, brushing a hand through her hair, a nervous gesture that only endeared her to me further. "Not at all," I assured her, a smile tugging at my lips. "I like hearing what you think." She glanced at me, her expression thoughtful. "You're kind. I suppose I haven't had someone to talk to like this in a long time." I felt a pang of empathy, realizing how lonely she must feel, hidden behind walls built from years of solitude and independence. I reached out, without thinking, my hand covering hers in a gentle, reassuring gesture. She looked down at our joined hands, a soft sigh escaping her lips as her fingers curled around mine. "It's strange," she said, her voice barely a murmur, "to feel a connection so easily, to find comfort in someone so unexpected." Her words struck a chord within me, and I tightened my grip on her hand, my heart pounding with an emotion I couldn't quite name. There was a sincerity in her words, an openness that felt rare, and I realized that despite the brief time we'd known each other, I felt the same. "Sometimes," I whispered, "people come into your life for reasons you don't understand. Maybe it's fate, or maybe it's just timing. She met my gaze, her eyes soft and searching, and in that moment, I felt an unspoken understanding pass between us, a shared acknowledgement of the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface since we met. It was as if we both knew that this wasn't just a chance meeting, that there was something deeper drawing us together, something neither of us could ignore. Without another word, she leaned back, her hand slipping from mine, but the warmth of her touch lingered, a reminder of the quiet intimacy we'd just shared. She cleared her throat, a faint smile on her lips as she glanced toward the window, as if to collect herself. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, her tone casual, but there was a softness in her voice, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. I nodded, grateful for the brief reprieve, for the chance to steady my own racing heart. She stood, crossing the room to a small coffee machine on the counter, and I watched her, taking in the graceful way she moved, the calm, measured confidence in every step. There was something hypnotic about her, an allure that felt both natural and magnetic. As she poured the coffee, I joined her, standing beside her as she handed me a steaming mug. Our fingers brushed again, and I saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes, a brief widening of her gaze that told me she felt it too. The air between us grew thick, charged with the weight of everything unspoken, and for a moment, I forgot where I was, lost in the quiet intensity of her presence. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and in that gaze, I saw a reflection of my own emotions: curiosity, attraction, and a hint of trepidation. There was a vulnerability in her expression, a softness that made my chest tighten, and I knew in that moment that this was no ordinary connection. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand settling on her shoulder, a gentle, reassuring touch that conveyed everything I couldn't say aloud. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into my touch, her hand coming up to rest on mine, her fingers warm against my skin. We stood like that for a moment, the silence between us deep and comforting, as if we'd found a small sanctuary in each other's presence. "I feel at peace with you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but the emotion in her words struck me deeply. I swallowed, my own voice catching in my throat as I replied, "I feel the same." Her fingers tightened around mine, a silent affirmation of the connection that had grown between us. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the quiet struggle between desire and restraint. And I knew she was weighing the consequences, the implications of what was happening between us. But I also saw something else, a quiet acceptance, a wicked courage to fight. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I leaned closer, my hand drifting up to brush a stray strand of hair from her face. She didn't flinch. Instead, she held my gaze, her breathing shallow, her eyes darkening with an emotion that mirrored my own. The world outside her office faded, leaving only the two of us, cocooned in the quiet mystery that had woven around us. Our faces were close, so close that I could feel the warmth of her breath on my skin, see the faint blush on her cheeks, and for a brief moment I hesitated, unsure of what to do next. But then she looked at me, her eyes soft and filled with a quiet intensity that made my heart pound. And in that gaze, I found the answer. I leaned in, my lips brushing hers in a soft, tentative kiss, a gentle exploration that felt both exhilarating and surreal. She responded, her hand coming up to cup my face, her fingers warm against my skin as she pulled me closer, deepening the kiss. There was a tenderness in her touch, a gentleness that spoke of patience and experience, and I found myself melting into her. The kiss was slow, unhurried, a careful dance that felt both new and familiar, as if we were rediscovering something we'd always known. Her hands slid up to my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I felt the warmth of her body against mine, a comforting presence that grounded me even as I felt myself slipping further into the depths of our shared connection. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads resting against each other, our breaths mingling in the quiet of her office, there was a moment of silence, a stillness that felt both profound and fragile. I looked at her, searching her eyes for any sign of regret, but there was none. Only a quiet acceptance, a shared understanding of the line we'd just crossed. She let out a soft sigh, her fingers still tangled in my hair as she looked at me, a faint smile playing on her lips. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she murmured, her voice filled with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. I smiled, my own voice soft as I replied, "Maybe it was. Maybe we just didn't know it." She laughed quietly, a sound filled with warmth and a hint of vulnerability, and I felt my heart swell at the sight of her, so open and unguarded. She released her hold on me, stepping back slightly, but the connection between us remained, a silent promise that neither of us could deny. We stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle around us, both of us aware that we had crossed a boundary, one that could never be undone. There was a gravity in her gaze, a quiet intensity that told me she understood the significance of what we'd just shared, the impact it would have on both of us. But there was also a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that felt both grounding and liberating. Our eyes remained locked, an unspoken question lingering between us. I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her gaze, as if she was weighing what this meant, what consequences might follow. But beneath that hesitation, there was a softness, a willingness to let herself feel this, to hold on to the connection that had sparked between us. Gently, she let her hand slip from my shoulder, her fingers grazing my arm as she stepped back, as if grounding herself in the reality of our surroundings. She looked away for a moment, her gaze drifting to the view beyond the office window. The afternoon light cast a warm glow across her features, and I could see a faint smile touching her lips. A smile filled with quiet joy and a hint of mischief. "Maybe," she began softly, "we needed this, even if we didn't know it." Her words hung in the air, carrying an honesty that resonated deeply within me. I knew what she meant. that sometimes life brings unexpected moments that leave lasting marks, moments that hold meaning, even if they come with complexity and risk. I felt my heart quicken, a mix of exhilaration and calm settling over me as I realized that she too was feeling the same unnodoubtable moments that leave lasting moments that lead to hope, love, meaning, truth. You feel this power. I took a step closer, reaching for her hand, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she met my gaze with an openness that took my breath away. Whatever this is, I said, my voice barely a whisper, I don't want to let it go. Her fingers tightened around mine, a silent acknowledgement of the truth we both shared. She looked at me, her expression softened by vulnerability and warmth, and I could see the walls she'd built over years of solitude and resilience slowly coming down, if only for this moment. She let out a soft sigh, a mixture of relief and acceptance. There's something about you, she murmured, her gaze unwavering. Something I didn't expect. And maybe that's what I needed. Her words were a quiet confession, a glimpse into the deeper parts of her that she rarely revealed. I felt a surge of tenderness, an instinct to protect this fragile connection that had unfolded between us, to honor the trust she had placed in me. Even if neither of us fully understood where this might lead. We stood there, our hands still intertwined, and I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. It was as if time had slowed, leaving only the two of us in the quiet sanctuary of her office, away from the noise of the outside world. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding that didn't require words. Her gaze softened, and she gave my hand a gentle squeeze, as if to anchor us both in this moment. Without breaking our connection, she led me to a small sofa by the window, and we sat down, side by side, still holding hands. The sunlight poured in, casting a golden glow across the room, and for a moment, it felt like we were suspended in a space that belonged only to us. I could feel the warmth of her shoulder against mine, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and the quiet contentment that seemed to radiate from her. It's strange, she said softly, her gaze fixed on the view outside. I've spent so many years trying to be strong, independent, and untouchable, but here I am, finding comfort in the presence of someone I barely know, and it feels like the most natural thing in the world. I listened, sensing the weight of her words, the honesty that came from a place of deep reflection. Maybe that's what makes this real, I replied gently. Sometimes the connections that mean the most are the ones that come out of nowhere, that defy all logic. She looked at me, a hint of wonder in her eyes, and for a moment I could see the years of loneliness, the guarded resilience that had shaped her life, slowly giving way to something softer, something more open. I reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, my fingers lingering as I traced the curve of her cheek. She closed her eyes at the touch, her face relaxing, and I felt her lean into my hand, allowing herself to be vulnerable in a way that made my chest tighten with emotion. As the moments passed, we drifted closer, drawn by an invisible force that felt as natural as breathing. Her hand found its way to my face, her fingers brushing lightly over my skin, and I felt a warmth spread through me, grounding me in the quiet intensity of her touch. She opened her eyes, meeting my gaze with an openness that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Is this too much?" she asked softly, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. I shook my head, my own voice barely above a whisper. "No, this is exactly right." Phew. With that, the last of our hesitations faded, and I leaned in, my lips meeting hers, in a kiss that was slow, gentle, and filled with a tenderness that surprised even me. She responded, her mouth soft and warm, her hand resting on my cheek as she pulled me closer, deepening the kiss. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a mutual recognition of the connection we'd found, a connection that went beyond words, beyond explanation. The kiss deepened, and I felt her fingers slide up into my hair, her touch confident yet gentle, a quiet assertion of her own desire. Her lips moved against mine in a slow, unhurried rhythm, each kiss a reaffirmation of the bond we'd formed, a bond that felt as natural as it was undeniable. I could feel her heart beating against mine, a steady rhythm that matched my own, grounding us in the intimacy of the moment. We pulled back slightly, our foreheads resting against each other, our breaths mingling in the quiet of her office. Her eyes were soft, filled with a warmth and gratitude that made my heart ache. She brushed her thumb over my cheek, a small, tender gesture that spoke of a depth of feeling neither of us had anticipated. "Oh, I didn't know I could feel like this again," she murmured, her voice barely more than a breath. I smiled, my hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. "Neither did I. But I'm glad we found each other." She closed her eyes, a contented sigh escaping her lips as she leaned into my touch, allowing herself to be held, to be seen, in a way that went beyond the polished facade she usually wore. There was a vulnerability in her, a softness that felt both fragile and incredibly strong, and I found myself wanting to protect it, to honor the trust she had placed in me. The minutes passed in a comfortable silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, yet deeply aware of the other's presence. I could feel the weight of her head resting against my shoulder, the warmth of her hand in mine, and I felt a peace I hadn't known I was missing. The connection between us was quiet, unassuming, yet undeniably real, a bond that didn't need explanations or promises, only the simple truth of what we felt in that moment. Eventually, she pulled back slightly, her gaze drifting to the view outside, her expression thoughtful. "It's strange," she said softly, a faint smile touching her lips. "I thought I knew what my life would look like by now, that everything would be settled, predictable, but here I am, finding comfort in something completely unexpected." I nodded, sensing the depth of her words, the honesty that came from a place of quiet reflection. "Maybe that's the beauty of life," I replied, my voice gentle. "Sometimes the things we need most are the things we never saw coming." She looked at me, a warmth in her gaze that felt like sunlight, and I felt a surge of emotion, a quiet joy, that took me by surprise. We sat in comfortable silence, our hands still joined, and I realized that whatever this was, whatever we'd found together, it was something neither of us could have anticipated. Something that went beyond mere chance. As the afternoon light faded, casting a soft glow across the room, she leaned back, a serene smile on her face. I could see a peace in her, a quiet acceptance that mirrored my own, and I knew that, for both of us, this moment was enough. We didn't need words or explanations, only the simple truth of what we felt, a truth that would remain even as the world outside her office moved forward. Our connection was something that couldn't be undone, something that would leave a lasting mark, a quiet reminder of the unexpected beauty life sometimes brings. And as we sat there, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence, I knew that this moment would stay with me, a memory etched into my heart, a testament to the quiet moment of unknown. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a gentle twilight over the room, she turned to me, her gaze filled with a warmth that took my breath away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with a sincerity that resonated deeply within me. For seeing me, for being here." I squeezed her hand, my own voice catching in my throat as I replied, "Thank you for letting me." We sat in silence, our hands intertwined, and as the world outside faded into evening, I felt a quiet sense of contentment, a peace that went beyond words. Whatever happened next, whatever paths we might take, I knew that this moment, this connection, would remain a quiet, enduring memory of a day spent in her office, where time stood still and all that mattered was the warmth of her hand in mine. And in that silence, as we sat together, I knew that I had found something rare, something beautiful, a connection that would remain, a memory that would linger, and a piece of her that would stay with me, forever intertwined with my own. The world outside her office had shifted into twilight, casting long shadows across the floor, giving the room a feeling of quiet serenity. We sat together in the stillness, hands intertwined, each of us wrapped in the peace of this newfound connection. I could feel her heartbeat, steady and calming, resonating with my own, and it felt as though time had slowed, allowing us to simply exist in this moment, free from expectations and the constraints of reality. Her gaze drifted to our joined hands, a faint smile touching her lips as she traced her thumb along the back of my hand. "It's strange," she murmured, her voice soft and thoughtful. "How easily you've come into my life. How natural it feels." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a warmth that was both comforting and vulnerable. "I wasn't expecting this, or you. And yet, here we are." I met her gaze, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for this moment, for the chance to see her, to know her in a way that went beyond words. "Sometimes," I replied quietly, "the things we need most are the ones that find us when we least expect them." I reached up, brushing my fingers along her cheek, and she leaned into the touch, closing her eyes as if savoring the warmth, the quiet comfort we'd found together. We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in a silence that felt sacred, each of us lost in our own thoughts, yet deeply connected. I could feel the weight of everything left unspoken between us, the uncharted path that lay ahead, and though it was filled with uncertainties, I knew that whatever happened, this moment would remain, untouched by the outside world. She opened her eyes, meeting my gaze with a look that was both gentle and steady. There's a part of me that wonders if this is just a beautiful moment in time, she said softly, her voice tinged with a hint of sadness. Something we'll look back on one day, something we'll remember fondly, but maybe not revisit. Her words settled between us, carrying a truth that resonated deeply. I felt a pang of regret, knowing that there were no easy answers, no promises we could make in the face of our own separate lives. But there was also a peace in the understanding that what we'd shared was real, that it would stay with us regardless of where life took us. Maybe it doesn't need to be more than that, I said gently, my voice steady. Maybe it's enough just to have found each other, to have shared this. I paused, choosing my words carefully, wanting her to know how much this had meant to me. You've changed something in me, Evelyn, and no matter where life leads, I'll carry this moment with me. I'll carry you with me. Her expression softened, and I saw a shimmer of emotion in her eyes, a quiet acceptance that mirrored my own. She reached out, her fingers brushing against my cheek, a tender, lingering touch that spoke of gratitude, of a shared understanding that went beyond words. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with sincerity, for being here, for seeing me. Her hand lingered on my cheek, and I covered it with my own, holding her gaze, letting her see the depth of my own gratitude, my own quiet wonder at the connection we had found. As the room fell into shadows, we sat together in that shared silence, each of us knowing that the end of this moment was inevitable, but finding solace in the fact that it had happened at all. I felt the weight of her hand in mine, the warmth of her presence beside me, and I knew that this would remain a memory I would revisit, a piece of her that I would carry with me always. Finally, she let out a quiet sigh, a soft, wistful sound that carried a sense of finality. She gave my hand a gentle squeeze, her fingers slipping from mine as she stood, her movements graceful, her expression serene. I stood with her, feeling a bittersweet ache settle in my chest, a quiet sadness tempered by the knowledge that this moment, however fleeting, had left an indelible mark on both of us. She looked at me, a gentle smile on her lips, and in her gaze, I saw a reflection of my own feelings, a gratitude for what we'd shared, a quiet acceptance of the parting that was now inevitable. Take care of yourself, she murmured, her voice filled with warmth, with a tenderness that brought a lump to my throat. You too, I replied softly, my voice steady, though my heart felt heavy. I reached out, brushing a hand over her arm, a final touch that spoke of everything I couldn't say aloud. Thank you, Evelyn, for everything. She nodded, her smile deepening, and with a quiet grace, she turned, walking toward the door. I watched her go, the soft light catching in her hair, catching her in a warm glow, and in that moment, she looked as timeless, as radiant as the feeling she'd left within me. I felt the quiet echo of her presence, the warmth of her touch, lingering long after she disappeared down the hallway. As I stood there, alone in the quiet of her office, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me, a contentment that went beyond words. I knew that this connection, this beautiful, fleeting moment we'd shared, would remain with me, woven into the fabric of who I was. It was a memory that would linger, a quiet reminder of the unexpected beauty life sometimes brings. And as I left her office, stepping into the cool night air, I carried with me the warmth of her presence, the weight of her hand in mine, a memory that would stay etched into my heart. A memory of Evelyn, of an afternoon filled with quiet laughter, gentle touches, and a connection that had come and gone like a passing breeze, leaving a lasting impression that would never fade